All right, so good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from across the country, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am here with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the very first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world through over 40 live, free, monthly interactive broadcasts, all of which go up on our YouTube channel and stay there forever. This week alone, we've had the chance to hang out with wood frogs, snakes. We've talked about astronomy, dinosaurs is coming up later today. We've got some psychology next week and more. It is so thrilling to get to share the amazing world of science and exploration with you every single day. Now, today I'm particularly excited because we are diving in with a new topic, something we've actually never covered before here, which is a real shame, and we're going to start remedying that immediately, and that is nuclear energy. In conjunction with Canada's nuclear laboratories, they are the preeminent Canada scientific technological outreach organization and beyond for nuclear energy. I'll flub that a little less next time I do it when we do another program with them. And today I'm thrilled to welcome in Larkin Mosscrop, who is as enthusiastic as I am. And for anyone who's been watching this program for more than like a week, you'll know that that really hardly ever happens, but it's really exciting to have someone who's as passionate about what they do as I am about this. And so without further ado, I'm going to welcome in Larkin to blow your mind about some really cool stuff associated with nuclear energy in Canada and beyond. Without further ado, Larkin, welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here today to share my passion, which is nuclear science, and hopefully to ignite passion within all of you. So I am going to start with the slideshow. So let's see how this goes.
Let's do it. It's going to work. We worked in the test. This is half the fun. Beautiful. We are golden. If you want to press the little hide button on the StreamYard sharing your screen thing on the bottom, perfect. Now you're all set to go.
Perfect. As I said, I am so excited to be here to talk to you guys about nuclear now and in the future, and really why you need to care about it and how nuclear can change our world. I'm here from Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. We are a science organization that has been around since the early 40s, 1940s, when it started as a research organization for atomic energy and clean use of nuclear. So why this is really cool is actually I have seen photos of the first reactor that we built here on site, the CANDU reactor, and horses were actually pulling up components of the reactor building. So although we've changed quite a lot, we've had 2 operating reactors on site. We still have a small one. We continue to be Canada's nuclear energy and nuclear science organization. And I can't wait to tell you guys all about nuclear. So first, let's just talk a little bit about energy. So we have high carbon energy sources. So those are things like fossil fuels. So that includes natural gas, coal, and petroleum. We also have low carbon energy sources. Nuclear is a low carbon source. We're going to talk a lot about why that is throughout this presentation. But then we also have things like hydro, hydroelectric, solar, and wind. So those are things that most of you probably know are low carbon. Now, if you're wondering why biomass is not in either one, it's because it's known as carbon neutral. And carbon neutral just means that as the tree grows or the plant grows, in the case of corn ethanol, then what's happening is they're absorbing carbon from the air. And then when it burns, it's emitting that same amount of carbon. So depending on the scale that you're looking at, which could be anywhere between 25 years to 1 million years, that biomass is carbon neutral. Now, why do we care about carbon? And why does nuclear matter in this conversation? Well, because of climate change. And this is Earth Week, and actually Earth Day, I think, is today. And so we really do care about how we can prevent climate change. And one of those ways is by looking at our energy sources. Now, you might be thinking about nuclear being completely unrelated to clean energy because of, say, construction costs or construction materials. But you might also just be thinking about waste. Both of those things we're going to cover. Today, I'm showing you in this figure how much raw material, which means how much material do we need to make this amount of energy. So the scale on that side is tons per gigawatt hour, which really just means it's enough power to support the electricity of about 150 people per year. So a little bit less here in Canada because we do actually use quite a lot of electricity and energy. So you can see here, hydro uses a lot of concrete, 15 tons per gigawatt. And that's actually because of those huge dams that we see when we look across rivers that have been dammed. Now, hydro is kind of at its capacity right now in Canada because All the big rivers that could be dammed have been, but also when they were done, there was a lot of environmental damage associated with those. And so damming practices moving forward have a lot more environmental considerations. Now, wind comes up second with having a lot of concrete and a lot of steel. Solar continues with having different materials such as aluminum, steel, and concrete, as well as copper and plastics. And then nuclear comes in with actually the lowest amount of materials per gigawatt. And that's because of the energy density. Now, what is energy density? Energy density is the amount of energy we can get out of something. And uranium is kind of a magic fuel. This is a chunk of uranium brought to you by the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan. In Canada, we have the world's largest deposits of high-grade uranium, which means that it's the highest quality uranium, has the highest amount of U-235 without contaminants in it. Kazakhstan is the #1 exporter and producer of uranium worldwide, followed by us, and then third, we have Australia. We export nearly 85% of uranium that we produce in Canada, and the other 15% we use in our CANDU reactors here in Ontario and New Brunswick. But why does it matter? Well, the energy density of a uranium atom is huge, all because of nuclear fission. So nuclear fission, it's actually easier than it sounds. So I have up here the picture that shows nuclear fission, but I'm going to break it down a little bit easier. So imagine that these two things are protons. Protons are positively charged particles. And these two protons, if you try to push together two positively charged protons, they're not going to want to go together. It's kind of like putting a magnet together and then flipping one over. You'll feel the resistance. Same thing with these protons. So if you try as hard as you can, they won't go together. But that's where this neutron comes in. So this neutron is neutral. It has no charge. And so it allows the positive protons to sit tighter together. And actually, this is exactly what's happening inside of the nucleus. The nucleus has they have protons and neutrons. The neutron levels vary, and so do the protons. And how many protons you have defines what atom we're talking about. So uranium is a really big, heavy atom. And it's got lots of different configurations of the nucleus with how many neutrons. But what would happen in this simplified case if we bumped that neutron out? Any ideas? What would happen if you bumped that neutron out is the protons would fly apart and that neutron would go flying. And that's exactly what nuclear fission is. It's pretty simple. A neutron comes in and bumps U-235, and it breaks in half, releasing huge amounts of heat and these fast neutrons. And by fast, I mean really fast, about 10,000 kilometers per second. And these fast neutrons go and hit another uranium, causing it to fission out. Now, these fission products that we see are smaller atoms than U-235, and they are nuclear fission products, meaning that they are radioactive. But this huge amount of heat that gets released creates that fancy, expensive kettle. Basically, how nuclear fission works is like any thermal plant. We cause lots and lots of heat to boil water. That water boils, creates steam. That steam turns a steam turbine, creating electricity. It's the exact same way if you had used coal or natural gas, but in this case, we're using nuclear material. And this is how a chain reaction works. That orange ball hit one of the mousetraps that have those neutrons in it, signifying the start of a nuclear reaction. And you can see as those neutrons all go around this box, which is the nuclear reactor, they're hitting other places and we're starting other reactions. This is a chain reaction. And this is how nuclear reactors work. So what we do is we control the speed at which these balls can be moving around. This is done through the moderator. The moderator in our reactors, the CANDU reactor, is heavy water, which means it helps to slow the reaction, the neutrons down, creating more reactions instead of them bouncing all over the place. But radiation, it's actually a lot simpler than you might think it is, and it's all around us. Background radiation is something that happens because of cosmic rays, because of the materials in the earth that might have isotopes. And there's lots of different types. The first type is called alpha radiation. And this is a highly active type of radiation. And you can detect it with things like this. This is an alpha meter. And this alpha meter detects only alpha radiation. You can see here that that is the scanner that it has. We'll use it a little bit later on. It can be stopped by something as simple as paper, but it's also known as being stopped by just our layer of skin, our external layer of skin. So although alpha can be really highly radioactive, it actually doesn't do much damage to you unless it's ingested. The next is beta rays. These betas are a little bit less active than those alphas, but they can go through the layer of paper, but does get stopped by our thin aluminum. And that's actually why I have this TLD here. This is how you measure the dose to my body when I'm here at Canadian Nuclear Labs. You can see here that there's a thin piece of aluminum, and that thin piece of aluminum allows the dosimeters, which is this thing, to actually tell how much beta rays I've been exposed to versus gamma, because gamma will go right through this. Gamma is the next one, along with X-rays. And we're all really familiar with X-rays because you've probably had a few. The gamma ray can be stopped by thick lead. And that's why when you go to the dentist, you put on a big lead jacket to protect your organs from those X-rays. And then finally, those neutrons. And you can see here, neutrons can be stopped by lots of water. And that's why a lot of reactors have big water sources. Now, let's use the Geiger counters to figure out what types of radiation we have. This is called a Geiger counter. It's a machine that tells me about radiation in the environment. I'm just going to turn it on. Every time the Geiger counter beeps, it means that there is a reaction happening. An isotope is breaking apart, and that's measuring our background radiation. Jesse, can you just confirm you can hear this okay?
Absolutely. It's so cool. It's one of my favorite things in all of science.
Okay, perfect. So now I brought some cool stuff with me that you might be familiar with. The first is this smoke detector. This smoke detector has a source of americium-241 in it. It's also pretty old. So if I put this beta counter up against the source, you'll hear that it goes a bit faster. And that's because it's detecting the beta and gamma radiation from this source of americium. I also brought a special sample of salt. It's not normal salt. It's something called potassium salt. So it's potassium chloride, and it's made for people who can't have sodium. So you can see it's just normal, and I could eat it, but I'd probably let kids hold it too much for me to put it in my mouth. But as I put the Geiger counter up against it, you'll hear that it goes faster still.
Cool.
And that's detecting potassium. But did you know if you've had a banana today, maybe this week, or even this month, or maybe even if bananas are your favorite food, you actually have a peak of potassium-40 in your body. And that's because potassium-40 is a naturally occurring radioisotope. Now, I brought this next thing, which is pretty cool. In the 1940s, people used to have this glass. This glass is really cool because it's beautiful. And it also is cool because it has uranium inside of it. So it's called uranium glass. How I knew what it was is that when I bought it, I had a special trick. I'm going to show you right now. The special trick to finding out about uranium glass is if it glows in the dark. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
That is uranium fluorescing from the black light. And so
Cool.
under black light, uranium glass actually glows in the dark. So that's how you can tell about uranium glass if you don't have a Geiger counter. But since I do, I can show you again that, in fact, the uranium glass does set off the Geiger counter too. But finally, before we move on from that, I really want to show you and introduce you again to my friend, the uranium ore. The uranium ore has a lot of U-235 in it. That's what we use in our reactors. As I move it closer to the Geiger counter, which I'm not going to do when I'm talking because you won't be able to hear either, you'll hear just how much fissile, or how much breaking apart of atoms, is happening. That's a lot. But what if for every single beat, 1,000 atoms were breaking apart? Let's hear what that would be like. It's still a lot. And so that's what's really cool about uranium. Because it's such a huge atom, it wants to break apart, and it breaks apart quite often. And so that Geiger counter was telling me that hundreds of thousands of atoms were breaking apart every time as it was close to it. Every minute, hundreds of thousands were breaking apart. So that's why it's a great source of nuclear material. Now, quickly to the alpha meter, because it's actually very cool to show the difference. I'm just going to turn it on. And again, every time it beeps, it is detecting a particle. If I bring it close to the uranium, it'll start going off. But if I use something as simple as a piece of paper to cover the alpha meter, it no longer goes off. And that's again because the alpha particle can't get through that piece of paper. So although it's highly radioactive, that alpha, it actually is less damaging because it can't get even through your skin. So that's radiation. It's not as scary as you might have thought, and it's really easy to detect. And so as a scientist, I actually don't mind having a site that has radiation in it because I can easily find it with my Geiger counters. So who has already used nuclear to decarbonize their grid, and how did they do it? Well, for the most part, you can see here that you've either used nuclear or hydro to decarbonize. So if you don't have a lot of water, there's only really one way. And the reason that our friend Greta Thunberg is there is because last summer she said it would be foolish to shut down a reactor that was currently operating. Now, this is a huge thing because she originally was very against nuclear, but then seeing how it can be used to decarbonize and reduce the amount and reliance on fossil fuels, she started to support the use of ongoing nuclear. But I mentioned this CANDU reactor. This is actually a reactor that was designed and built first here at Chalk River. And there's lots all around the world. We started with the NRX reactor, which was the National Research Experimental Reactor. This reactor was a small reactor that we did a lot of research in. It grew into NRU and then NPD, and then we started building bigger and bigger units. And Bruce, out in Southern Ontario, is actually the largest nuclear generating station in the entire world. And that picture you see up on the top right corner, that's actually a calandria face at an OPG reactor, so Ontario Power Generation. And those are all of the fuel channels. What you're seeing is the calandria tube with the pressure tube inside. And then inside the pressure tube is our fuel bundle. Our fuel bundle sits like that, and there's a spacer that sits in between. And that's exactly what a single fuel channel looks like. We'll get back to my fuel in a while. But there's so much more than just the CANDU reactor or light water reactors. There's so many new technologies, including advanced nuclear, as well as taking our old concepts and making them new again. So the pebble bed reactor is the one that you see on the far left. And actually all the fuel in there are just small balls that look about this size. And they're a special type of fuel called triso. So they're melt proof. They're ceramic around the outside with the fuel in the middle. Again, same way, creates lots and lots of heat, which then creates boiling water and steam. The molten salt reactor works the same way with molten salts, so really high temperature salts with fuel mixed in amongst it that again creates steam and heat and turns the turbine. What actually made me love the molten salt reactor was this holding tank at the bottom with the freeze valve. The freeze valve is just like a chunk of ice, basically, that once the molten salt reactor gets out of temperature of what it's expected to, it actually just melts that freeze valve and it dumps into the holding tank, stopping the reaction. So a lot of these advanced nuclear technologies are a lot safer than our other reactors where we have active safety systems. All reactors have defense in depth, which means we have lots of procedures and processes as well as safeguards and technologies in place to keep them safe. Now, on that far right side is something called a tokamak. A tokamak is for fusion energy, and fusion is the opposite of fission, where fission is breaking apart atoms. Fusion is pushing them together to create lots and lots of energy, exactly like what happens on the sun. And why that's exciting is because it lowers the amount of nuclear waste. Now, nuclear waste is something that everybody talks about when they talk about nuclear, because it's something that's going to last for a few thousand, if not a million years. But if all the power you came from nuclear, it would all fit within a soda can. And that's because the amount of high-level waste is so small. It's about 3% of all the waste produced is high level. And that high level is the stuff that's going to last a long time. Now, when a fuel bundle comes out of a reactor, this fuel bundle then can be processed to either strip off the zirconium, which is this metal you see, and then it's down to just the fuel pellets that's inside. Or this whole fuel bundle can stay in storage for a long time. Now, of course, when it first comes out of the reactor, it's both thermally hot, so ouch to the touch, as well as radioactively hot. So no one's actually touching this in their hands. But what they're doing is they're using robots to pull it out and put it in big bays of water for 2 to 3 years. Once that's done, it can go into dry storage. And dry storage, you can go and stand beside that dry storage container without any harm to yourself. Nuclear is not just one thing. Although I've focused a lot about energy today, nuclear actually supports 9 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So a couple of those are clean water and sanitation. Why that's important is because the amount of heat that's produced in a nuclear reactor can work towards desalination, allowing us to have fresh, clean water in areas that they don't have fresh water. Affordable and clean energy, there's in fact the cost of nuclear per kilowatt hour or gigawatt is lower than a lot of different sources of energy, including solar and wind. Climate and innovation, again, this is the focus on how do we create a better world. And one of those ways is through nuclear power. Because climate change is not just about electricity production. You can see here that in the States, 25% of our carbon in the atmosphere is coming from electricity production, but 24% is coming from industry. And so looking to decarbonize those types of industries is really important. And so how you can do it is through either a big reactor, which are the ones people think about now, the ones that are making lots and lots of energy, like 700 megawatts. In Finland, they recently just commissioned a 1,300 megawatt reactor. That's huge. That's about reactors, the smaller CANDUs. And this is used for lots of energy production. The small modular reactor can be up to 300 megawatts. It's also known as a community reactor. These reactors are great for places like far north, for example, that don't have access to clean energy, or remote mining sites that use a lot of energy but are remote, so cannot connect to the grid. This small modular reactor can be used for both heat and electricity. They can also be paired with a hydrogen generation station, which means that extra energy from there can be used in electrolysis to create hydrogen. And that hydrogen can then loop back to reduce the amount of carbon coming from transportation through hydrogen vehicles, sorry. And then finally, we can talk about the microreactor. These are also community level reactors and can be shipped up on the back of a truck up to any communities in order for them to have clean, reliable power for generations. It's also medicine. This is one of the most exciting things that CNL is working on right now, and that's alpha therapy. In the past, what we do is we had both Molly 99, which is a way of not treating cancer, but detecting it. This Molly would go inside of a target, which would then go inside of the reactor, be irradiated, and we'd be able to use it for cancer detection. We also produced cobalt-60, and inside of this jar, I'm not sure how easily you'll be able to see it, are these tiny little pellets. These tiny pellets would go inside of a capsule like this and then be irradiated. This cobalt-60 is a beta gamma emitter, and it is a really great radiation treatment. It's still used around the world. And although here at CNL, we no longer produce it, it's produced at OPG, Ontario Power Generation, and Bruce Power, as well as other places around the world. But here at CNL, we're working at alpha therapy. And these alpha particles can treat really aggressive cancers. You can see on that picture in the bottom, a cancer that then was treated with lutetium, which is a beta emitter. And you can see that middle diagram, the cancer really hadn't changed. In fact, it probably continued to grow because it was aggressive. But then when it was treated with actinium-225, which is an alpha emitter, and remember, really strong, but can't really get that far, look at the difference in the cancer. It's reduced a lot. And that's actually because there's a targeting molecule that acts just like a key that attaches to that alpha and finds the cancer and is specifically targeting that cancer. So alpha is the future of medicine. And here at CNL, we've been producing actinium for several years, and we're continuing to work with medical institutions and researchers to continue and grow this area. We're also looking at hybrid energy. We're creating that smarter electricity grid. That means that we're not just looking at big plants, but we're looking at smaller areas. We're looking at how we can integrate together in distribution and transmission, but then also how it's not going to be just one source of energy. We're always going to need lots more. The only thing we need to really work on is getting rid of the reliance we have on fossil fuels. And how we can do that is by having large nuclear stations that are providing reliable baseload power, as well as peaking or providing peak energy with wind and solar, and continuing to use our hydro resources that we have. But there's so much more to nuclear than just that. And I encourage you all to check out CNL's monthly podcast free of charge. Check out our CNL's YouTube channel. There's lots to see there. And follow us on Twitter or like us on Facebook for so many more options. Thank you so much, and I'm excited for questions.
Thank you, Larkin, for such an enthusiastic program and so many props. It's like an all-time record for the most props in one of our sessions, I think. So I appreciate that immensely. One of the first questions we got from one of our classes via email is, you have the Geiger counter. And of course, our familiarization with Geiger counters is TV movies where it's like the people in the room and they've got the big suit on and it's dangerous and you go away from the thing that are beeping like mad. So is it safe for you to be holding something that has like the salt like that, or the glass, or the uranium bit that's really beeping like that? How much is it actually emitting? And is it dangerous to you in any way?
Oh, that's such a great question. I appreciate that question so much. So that is the best part about being able to talk to you today about this, is actually, as you can see, I'm holding this piece of uranium. I could lick it, but the problem is it's a heavy metal. So in fact, you can't be licking the heavy metal, also because so many people have been touching it. However, what you can know is that inside there's isotopes that are breaking apart. And those isotopes are not emitting enough radiation to cause damage to the body. Right. They're not emitting the type of irradiation that would be coming from a reactor. And that's because there's as much as there's happening the hundreds of thousands, they're actually not creating any damage. This TLD that I was talking about actually allows you to measure how much. And this would be detecting nothing standing right beside this piece of uranium. So the Geiger detector detects the amount of breaking apart of atoms, but inside of those fission products that are emitting all of those different types of radiation, this is actually just counting it. It's not telling us the dose. Right. And so this is one of the things they always use on TV, but it doesn't actually tell you how damaging something is to you.
Right. It's just to illustrate that it's happening at all. And you mentioned the banana is a very good example, a salient one for a lot of people. I brought up a banana that I ate like 5 minutes before the program, just as an example. So I'm really glad we got that question. Thanks, guys. Our second sort of, symbol of nuclear power, which you had in one of the final pictures with the different size reactors, was these big towers. What are the big towers? What are they doing? Explain more.
Oh, yes. I get this question every time. Those are actually cooling towers normally associated with light water reactors. So again, as I said, the whole process of nuclear is we create lots and lots of heat. That heat turns into steam. And that steam is what you're seeing coming out of those cooling towers. In fact, that steam is coming right out of the cooling tower, and it looks a lot like smoke. But why we need to do that is because we need to release some of the steam. We can't use all of it in the steam turbines because of the different pressures and stuff associated with those turbines. Yeah. So all that is actually steam.
Just water vapor. There you go. Speaking of water, and we got this, and I know this has been in news articles in the past on things. So you talked about water coming in, the nuclear reactions, heating it up. We're creating the steam that's giving us the power. When that water, where does that water go once it's been used? Is it in a closed loop in the nuclear plant? If it does go back to a water source like a lake or a river, is it radiated in any way, or anything you could explain on that would be great.
Sure. It's never touching the fuel. It's not even touching anything nuclear. So actually that water doesn't come into contact with anything at all. That water comes into contact with outside containers. And so I showed a picture where you could see the vessel and the water, there was a pipe that came beside the vessel. So that pipe has the water in it, and it's getting heated up by just the temperature of that vessel in general. It also has water that can go up through, but for example, it would never be within, if this is the CANDU reactor. Yep. So inside you have the pressure tube. This pressure tube inside of here, there would never be water touching your tube at all. The water would be going outside because the inside of the reactor, all of this is very, very hot. This is like 300 to 500 degrees. Wow. And so it's not going to, the water never comes into direct contact with the nuclear fuel. And so that water is just hot. When it comes out of reactor, it's actually doesn't ever get irradiated.
Very cool. Thanks, Larkin. Ms. Almeida's class, what other Canadian provinces use nuclear power as a major source of energy? You highlighted Ontario in that graph with a bunch of other countries. Are there other provinces that have nuclear, and to what degree?
Yes, there are different countries around the world. A lot of countries have them. In Canada, there are 2 provinces that have nuclear energy, active nuclear energy. There was 3. The 2 are Ontario, as we mentioned, with 60% of our electricity coming from nuclear, and New Brunswick. New Brunswick has a solo single CANDU reactor called Point Le Pro. And then in Quebec, there were 2 operating reactors called Gentil 1 and Gentil 2. And those 2 reactors have been decommissioned, are undergoing safe storage and decommissioning right now because they were closed due to political reasons. Somebody said that they would close them down if they were elected into government. And within 1 week, they were shut down. And within 1 month, everyone had their pink slips, which means they were fired. And then within a year, they were in safe shutdown.
That's the fastest I've ever heard government work. There you go. Actually, on the note of closing, the second class, will Pickering close the nuclear plant for Ms. Almeida's class? Do we know?
So there's been lots of conversation about Pickering, and Pickering is an amazing reactor. It's one of the older ones if you saw during that slide. And actually that's because, so there's smaller units. Pickering units 2 and 3 were closed back in the 90s during a refurb, and they were paired with 1 and 4. So right now at Pickering, we've got 6 units, 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And actually the discussion that's now is possibly life extension or continued operations in 5, 6, 7, and 8, but closure of units 1 and 4. And this is not confirmed. However, they are looking at the energy requirements of Ontario and seeing would it make sense to close those units down or to continue their operations or do refurbishment. Now, there's a lot of complications associated with that because, as I said, these units are some of our smaller CANDU reactors. However, they are still, a nuclear reactor can operate for 30, 60, 90 years with certain refurbishment periods in between.
Out of curiosity, and this, I guess, is a nice follow-up to the idea of some of them closing, on a global scale, how much energy is produced by nuclear, and are we increasing or decreasing in that right now? What's the current wave?
Yeah, so worldwide, we have about 15 to 20% nuclear energy. So it's not as high as it could be, closer to the 15 mark. It kind of varies depending on the year because when reactors are shut down for refueling, for example, which happens in a lot of reactors, but not the CANDU reactor, there's going to be less and more. However, nuclear is unfortunately affected by differing opinions and how people feel about it. It's a very emotional type of energy. So after Fukushima, we saw the decline of nuclear around the world. Yep. But with our current climate situation, we're starting to see nuclear really being ramped up and considered. So although, for example, Germany just closed down its final 3 reactors, unfortunately, losing a lot of clean energy and higher reliance on coal, Finland just put up its reactor, and that reactor now will operate for probably about 60 years. And so we are seeing growth across the organization, Canada and nuclear. And I think we are going to continue to see that growth with the small modular reactors. 3 are planned in Canada within the next decade. And I know around the world, they're starting to do more and more demonstrations. And China, for example, is planning on building about 20 to 30 new reactors in the next 20 years.
Fantastic. If you need a drink of water, by the way, that was a long answer. Yeah, take a sec. It's interesting that you mentioned a point during the broadcast, and it's something that I really want to harp on because it's something that I think a lot of kids and a lot of people my age, certainly millennials, felt this way. When I was a kid, I grew up. Nuclear was bad. It was evil. It was everything else. That was what I heard. And I mean, I really did. When I was younger, I was like, no, nuclear, no solar, wind only. And basically, the evidence persuaded me. And this is something that you addressed in your talk today. But I mean, if you look at the track record of nuclear power in the world, there tends to be people linked to things like Fukushima, basically, as opposed to decades and decades of continuous use, safe use, all the benefits associated with it. I think that's something that we're hopefully going to start seeing more of as climate considerations come into the fore, and we start figuring out how we are going to spread our energy generation around the world. So thank you for that, Larkin. I'm glad we got that question. Let's take another one from our group online. How do you process the uraniums? You talked about sort of having favorite question ever. Okay, so I'll just leave you with that. How do you process uranium?
Well, it's funny because I realized I forgot to tell you about it. I even have stuff here. Okay, so this is a piece of uranium ore. It has uranium in it, but it's also got other types of rock. We process it into this product right here, this yellow product. This is called yellow cake. It's uranium oxide. So what we do is we take that uranium, we break it apart, we do chemical processing to be able to get our uranium oxide. This is yellow cake. The reason it's in this resin is actually because if you ingested that, it'd be very dangerous for you because it's a heavy metal, not because of the radioactivity. Again, I can hold it, it's not hurting me. So this uranium oxide is the processed uranium that then gets made into our pellets. These pellets, this is a white one just because it was a trial with a different type of ceramic, but normally they actually look like this black little pellet. This black little pellet, 8 of those can fuel your home for the entire year.
Cool. So how are you taking it from, I mean, sort of you're oxidizing it to get with the yellow cake you mentioned, but how much, you talked about Canada being one of the biggest exporters in the world, we've got a lot of uranium. How much are we actually mining? Is there a way to visualize this? Do you have an amount? I know like tons of things is always difficult to sort of visualize, but anything you can share?
Yeah, so in terms of the amount, it really depends on the quality of the ore that you're extracting. And so the footprint of nuclear energy is the smallest amongst wind and solar, for example. So if you were to take the same amount of energy to power a small city from wind, you would need about 180,000 football fields. That includes the harvesting of materials as well as the actual space for wind production. For solar, you would need about 150,000 football fields of space. And that again includes all of the mining associated with it. And then nuclear, you only need about 1,200 football fields. And that includes the amount of space we have for mining, et cetera, as well. And that's because of how energy dense our fuel is.
Yep. Very, very cool. Larkin, time flies when you're having fun. We're nearing the end of the broadcast. I want to highlight again, cnl.ca, the easiest URL of any organization we've worked with in ages. So thank you for that. So much to discover there. You highlighted the podcast series. Is there anywhere else that jumps out that kids could go to find out more information that's accurate about nuclear power when they're done this broadcast? CNL has a lot. Anything else that jumps to mind?
The CNA does also have quite a few things, but CNL has a lot of material for people to check out. YouTube's also a really great place to go to look at nuclear videos. The thing I'd like to just encourage you is to always have a questioning attitude. If you're seeing something that's only telling you the positives or only telling you the negatives, to always look at both and use your science minds to figure out what actually makes sense and what is good and what isn't as good, because there's a lot of bad stuff out there. But having our minds open and using that curiosity can help us to find out the truth.
Curiosity and critical thinking could be like our subtitle as an organization, basically. I think it's an important message no matter what you're looking up, and I'm really glad you highlighted that. I'm curious, before we wrap up, how did you get so interested in this? What's the path to end up here for any students that are might be as keen as you on nuclear power?
Sure. I actually know nothing about nuclear 10 years ago before I started here at Chalk River. I was a biologist. I've had my master's degree in science, studying lakes and lake ecosystems. I've always loved science. And I lived in Ontario my whole life and never knew that so much of our power was coming from nuclear reactors. When I started here at Chalk River, it was really just because it was an environmental job. I started in environmental remediation, learning how to clean up sites with nuclear contamination. And from there, I was hooked. I fell in love with reactors and fell in love with all things nuclear, how it can really contribute to climate change and how it's not just energy, it's all of these other things. That's what brought me to where I am now. And one of my most favorite things to do is talk to people about nuclear because, again, it's something that has a lot of feelings associated with it. And you can't just do it. You can't just talk about nuclear. You need to talk about how it can change the world. And I think of all the types of energy, nuclear is one of the ones that can change the world. And so with that, that's where my passion comes from. And that's why I'm so excited about it. So biologist to nuclear scientist and beyond.
Well, I've got to tell you, your passion certainly shines through, and I'm really glad we had the chance to do this program together. I couldn't agree more. I think nuclear is a huge part of our energy future, and it's really exciting to get to hear some of the science and enthusiasm behind it. Again, classes, check out cnl.ca to learn even more. Thank you so much, Larkin, for such an exciting broadcast. We'll wrap it up there. Have a